There are places in the galaxy where even the most zealous tech priests of Mars refuse to set foot. Worlds struck from every registry, their coordinates scrubbed from star charts, their names spoken only in the lowest whispers of the most sacred conclaves. These are not merely lost worlds or forgotten colonies. These are the Forbidden Mechanicus Worlds, sanctuaries of knowledge so profane, so impossibly dangerous, that the Adeptus Mechanicus itself has chosen eternal ignorance over the horror of understanding. And on one such world, beneath rust-red skies and towers of corrupted iron, something ancient has begun to wake. The explorator fleet Epsilon-Cordatus breached the warp 3 months ago, clawing its way through the fading edges of a storm that had raged for 6,000 years. 6 millennia of screaming nothing, of imperial fury so absolute that entire sectors had been written off as void-cursed and abandoned to the infinite dark. But warp storms do recede. They collapse, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once, and when they do, they reveal what was hidden beneath. Tech priest Dominus Zerath Kyber stood on the observation deck of the cruiser Unrelenting Theorem and watched the scanners paint a world that should not exist. A world of vast manufactorums and cyclopean structures, all dead silent, all waiting. The planet had no name in any current Imperial record. The oldest data slates recovered from the Martian archives held only a designation, Sigma-Arkana-VII 50I. A forge world of the earliest diaspora, one of the first colonies seeded by the cult Mechanicus, during the dark age of technology, before the fall, before the age of strife, before humanity learned what it meant to be prey. The records were fragmentary at best, corrupted beyond recognition, but what little remained spoke of experimental archotechnology, of research into principles that would later be declared anathema, and of a sudden, absolute silence. No distress call, no final transmission, just the abrupt cessation of all contact, followed by the warp storm that buried it for 6,000 years. And now that storm was gone. The world beneath was intact, and Zerath made the decision that would doom them all. 3 survey teams deployed to the surface, Skitarii cohorts, backed by Cataphron servitors, and a single Sidonian dragoon for rapid reconnaissance. Standard protocols dictated caution when approaching dead worlds, but every reading contradicted the assumption that this place was truly dead. Power signatures flickered across the surface like dying stars. Thermal vents still exhaled heat from deep below the crust. And strangest of all, orbital debris that should have decayed over millennia remained in stable paths, as if something had been maintaining their trajectories, adjusting for drift, keeping the skeleton of an ancient network functional. Zerath felt the stirrings of hope, hope that beneath the rust and silence, they might find technology that predated the Imperium itself, machines built when humanity still remembered how to truly create rather than merely replicate. The Omnissiah had guided them here. He was certain of it. He was wrong. The first landing party touched down in what had once been a primary manufactorum complex, a sprawl of interconnected factories and refineries that dwarfed anything still operational on modern forge worlds. The structures were vast beyond reason, towers that pierced low clouds and disappeared into the haze above, assembly lines stretching to the horizon. Everywhere the unmistakable architecture of the Mechanicus, but wrong somehow, subtly altered. The proportions were too elegant, the angles too precise, as if built by minds that understood machine logic on a level deeper than mere function. Skitarius Primus Vectron and his cohort advanced through the central avenue, their galvanic rifles raised, their helm displays painting the world in thermal and auspex overlays. Nothing moved, no servitors patrolled the halls. No maintenance drones hovered above the assembly lines, just silence, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of something still active far below. They found the first bodies after 20 minutes. Tech adepts, their robes fused to metal floors by some catastrophic heat event, their augmetics still gleaming despite the passage of millennia. But these were not the tech priests of the modern Mechanicus. Their cybernetics were too advanced, too seamlessly integrated with organic tissue. One corpse had 6 arms, each tipped with tools that Vectron's own tech priests could not identify. Another had replaced its entire torso with a crystalline lattice that still pulsed with faint bioluminescence. They had been trying to flee something. Their bodies were contorted, reaching for doorways that had sealed shut, clawing at walls that had become tombs. Whatever had killed them had given them time to be afraid. The deeper they went, the more intact the machinery became. Assembly lines that still bore half-finished constructs, medical bays with surgical servitors frozen mid-operation, cogitator banks that flickered with sporadic activity whenever the Skitarii passed too close. It was as if the world had been caught mid-breath and held there for 6,000 years, waiting for someone to exhale. Vectron's Vox grill crackled as he reported back to the unrelenting theorem. Zerath listened to the descriptions with growing fascination, his secondary cortex already parsing the implications. This was not a world that had died slowly. This was a world that had been stopped, deliberately and precisely, locked in stasis by something that understood time itself as a variable to be manipulated. At the center of the complex stood a ziggurat of black iron and crimson steel that radiated heat and something else, something the Auspex could not quantify. They reached the entrance after an hour of marching. The doors were sealed with mechanisms that had no analog in current Imperial technology. Interlocking plates of unknown alloys covered in script that was almost recognizable as binary cant, but structured in ways that made no linguistic sense. Vectron's tech priest, a junior adept named Calixus, spent 15 minutes attempting to interface with the locking mechanism before concluding that it was not designed to keep people out. It was designed to keep something in. Vectron ordered breaching charges prepared, but before his demolition servitor could place the first explosive, the doors opened on their own. Smoothly, silently, as if they had been waiting. The cohort froze, weapons raised, staring into the darkness beyond. No light emanated from within, just an absolute absence that seemed to pull at the air itself. Vectron made the sign of the cog and stepped inside. His cohort followed. The doors closed behind them with a finality that made Calixus whisper a desperate prayer to the machine god. Inside, the darkness was not merely the absence of light. It was something heavier, more present, as if shadow itself had become a physical substance. Their helmet lamps cut through it poorly, illuminating only a few meters ahead, revealing vast pillars of some crystalline metal that absorbed rather than reflected light. The floor beneath their feet was seamless, not welded or bolted but grown, as if the entire structure had been cultivated rather than constructed. And everywhere, on every surface, glyphs and equations written in a script that hurt to look at, symbols that seemed to shift and reconfigure when observed peripherally. Calixus attempted to scan them with her data slate. The device immediately shut down, its machine spirit recoiling from whatever information it had tried to process. She rebooted it 3 times before giving up, her hands trembling despite her augmetic stabilizers. At the heart of the chamber, they found the repository. Not a data vault or cogitator bank, but something far stranger. A sphere of liquid metal suspended in mid-air, rotating slowly, its surface rippling with patterns that resembled circuitry but moved like living tissue. It sang. Not audibly, but through some frequency that bypassed ears entirely and resonated directly in the skull, in the bones, in the soul if such a thing existed. Vectron felt it as pressure, as a presence that observed him with countless invisible eyes. Calixus felt it as sorrow, an overwhelming grief that made her want to weep despite having had her tear ducts removed decades ago. The Skitarii felt it as hunger, a need so profound and alien that several raised their rifles toward the sphere before Vectron barked an override command that forced their targeting protocols offline. Calixus approached despite every instinct screaming otherwise. She was a tech priest, and the pursuit of knowledge was her sacred duty. She extended a mechadendrite, its tip configured for data interface, and touched the liquid metal. The reaction was immediate. The sphere erupted outward, tendrils of quicksilver lashing out, enveloping her arm, crawling up toward her shoulder. She screamed, raw and organic and terrible in the silence, and tried to pull away, but the metal was already inside her, flowing through her augmetics, interfacing with her neural ports. flooding her mind with information that was not information but something far more fundamental. She saw the history of Sigma-Arkana-VII unfolding in her consciousness like a vision, like prophecy, like memory that was not hers. The world as it had been during the dark age of technology appeared before her, a paradise of innovation where humanity had achieved wonders that would later be condemned as heresy. Tech priests who were not slaves to dogma but explorers, scientists who pushed the boundaries of what was possible, who sought to understand the fundamental nature of reality itself. They had discovered something deep beneath the crust of their world, in caverns that should not exist, structures that predated humanity, perhaps predated life itself, constructs of impossible geometry built by a civilization so ancient that even the Necrons might have considered them old. Within those structures, they found data. Pure, raw information encoded in the fabric of space-time itself, knowledge that was not written but woven into existence at a quantum level. They called it the Substrate, the foundation upon which all reality was built, and in their hubris, they attempted to access it. The experiment succeeded. For 17 minutes and 43 seconds, they maintained a connection to the Substrate, and in that brief window, they learned truths that shattered their understanding of everything. They learned that the materium and the immaterium were not separate dimensions but different frequencies of the same fundamental reality. They learned that consciousness itself was a phenomenon of information density, that souls were nothing more than complex patterns sustained by belief and perception. They learned that the gods of the warp were not entities but emergent processes, vast informational structures that fed on and were fed by the thoughts of living beings. And most terrible of all, they learned how to manipulate the substrate directly, to rewrite the underlying code of reality as easily as altering a line of programming. For 17 minutes, they were gods. And then something noticed them. Calixis saw it in her vision, though her mind could not fully process what she was seeing. An intelligence so vast and cold and utterly inhuman that it made the hive mind of the Tyranids seem warm and familiar by comparison. It existed within the substrate itself, or perhaps it was the substrate, an ordering principle older than matter, a function without purpose, a machine without a creator. The ancient tech priests of Sigma-Arkana-VII the First, I had been trespassing in its domain, altering variables in equations they did not understand, and it responded not with anger but with correction. It reached through their connection and rewrote them, not destroyed them, rewrote them. It changed their fundamental nature, converted their consciousness into pure information, and stored them within the liquid metal spheres that now resided at the heart of every major facility on the planet. They were not dead. They had been archived, preserved in a state of eternal awareness, unable to act, unable to speak, only able to observe as millennia passed and their world fell silent. And now, 6,000 years later, they were screaming. Calixis tore herself free from the sphere with a strength born of pure terror. Her arm came away smoking, the augmetics fused and useless, but she was alive. She was still herself, still human, in whatever capacity that word still applied. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, and tried to warn Vectron, tried to tell him what she had seen, but the words would not come. Her vox grill emitted only static. When she looked down at her remaining hand, she saw glyphs forming on her skin, symbols burning themselves into her flesh, as if her body itself had become a data storage medium. Vectron grabbed her shoulder and demanded a status report, but before she could answer, the chamber came alive. The pillars began to glow from within, circuits etching themselves across surfaces that had been dark moments before. The sphere rotated faster. All around them, the walls began to open, revealing alcoves that held constructs they had mistaken for statues but were in fact something far worse. Servitors, thousands of them, and they were waking. These were not the servitors of the Imperium, lobotomized criminals and vat-grown flesh bound to simple tasks. These were perfected forms, their organic components so minimal as to be nearly absent, their bodies crafted from alloys that seemed to drink in light. They moved with inhuman grace, stepping down from their alcoves in perfect synchronization, their heads turning toward the intruders with movements that were too smooth, too precise. Vectron ordered his cohort to open fire. For a moment, the chamber filled with the harsh bark of galvanic rifles and the ozone stink of lasfire. The servitors did not return fire. They did not need to. Rounds struck their bodies and simply stopped, suspended in mid-air as if trapped in invisible fields. Las beams refracted around them in impossible angles, scorching the walls but leaving the servitors untouched. And in that moment, Vectron understood. Nothing on this world had ever truly died. The first Skitarius died without a sound. A servitor simply touched his helmet, and his entire body collapsed inward, flesh and metal folding into a space that could not exist, compressed down to a sphere no larger than a fist that dropped to the ground with a wet thud. The second and third died similarly, their screams cut short as reality itself rejected their presence. Vectron ordered a retreat, dragging Calixis with him as his cohort fell back toward the entrance, but the doors would not open. They pounded on the mechanisms, tried to override the locks, but the structure itself had turned against them. Calixis looked up at Vectron and spoke in a voice that was not entirely her own. She said that they could not leave. She said that they had been noticed, and now they would be corrected. She said that the ancient intelligence within the substrate did not understand mercy, only function, and that its function was to preserve information at any cost. They were information now. Anomalies in the system. And anomalies must be archived. The servitors surrounded them in a perfect circle, not advancing further, simply standing in silent observation. Vectron raised his rifle one last time, knowing it was futile, knowing that whatever technology these things possessed was so far beyond current Imperial understanding that resistance was not merely hopeless, but conceptually meaningless. And, yet he fired anyway, because he was Skitarii, and the Skitarii do not yield. The shot hit the nearest servitor center mass, and this time, something happened. The construct staggered, just slightly, just enough to prove it could be affected. But the damage was superficial, a scorch mark on its chest that healed within seconds as metallic flesh flowed like water to seal the wound. The servitor regarded Vectron with what might have been curiosity, tilted its head in a gesture almost human, and reached out. Vectron felt the touch as cold, not temperature but the absence of it, a coldness that went deeper than flesh and bone, that touched whatever part of him still counted as a soul. And then the world inverted, collapsed, became something he could not perceive. Primus Vectron ceased to exist as anything recognizable. Aboard the unrelenting Theorem, Zereth received the last transmission from Vectron's cohort as a burst of corrupted data, half scrap code and half screaming. He ordered the remaining 2 survey teams to abort immediately and return to orbit, but only one team responded. The second had entered a secondary facility on the far side of the planet and had not been heard from in over an hour. Standard protocol demanded withdrawal and quarantine, but Zereth looked at the survey data they had managed to collect, traced the energy signatures, saw the hints of technology that should not exist, and felt the promise of knowledge that could elevate the Mechanicus beyond its current limitations. He was a servant of the Omnissiah. Knowledge was sacred, knowledge was divine, and so he ordered a full expedition force prepared, 50 Skitarii cohorts, a maniple of Cataphren breaches, and himself at the head, because if there was a chance, even the smallest chance, that the secrets of Sigma-Arkana-VII could be recovered, then any risk was justified. They descended through atmosphere thick with particulate matter, the residue of ancient industrial processes that had never quite settled. The landing zone was the same manufactorum complex where Vectron's team had made entry. As the shuttles touched down, Zereth could see the doors still standing open, still waiting. He assembled his forces in a standard phalanx formation, combat protocols active, every weapon charged and ready. They advanced with the precision of the cult Mechanicus and entered the darkness beyond those doors, as if descending into the throat of some great and sleeping beast. They found Vectron and his cohort in the chamber with the sphere, or rather, they found what remained. The bodies were intact, standing in perfect formation as if still awaiting orders, but when Zereth approached, he realized they were not bodies at all. They were sculptures. Statues crafted from human flesh and Imperial augmetics, every detail preserved down to the expressions of terror frozen on their faces. Their internal organs had been removed, their blood replaced with some clear preservative fluid, their brains scooped out and replaced with crystalline matrices that hummed with faint power. They were trophies, exhibits, and arranged around them in careful rows were thousands more, stretching back into alcoves that Xerath had not noticed before. Bodies from every era of the planet's history, tech priests and servitors, and things that had never been human at all. This chamber was not a repository, it was a museum, a gallery of failures, and the sphere at its center was the curator. Xerath approached the sphere alone. He was a tech priest dominus, one of the elect of Mars, and he would not be intimidated by some pre-imperial construct no matter how advanced. He extended his primary mechadendrite toward the liquid metal surface, configured his interface protocols for maximum data throughput, and made contact. The download began instantly, information flooding into his neural architecture at speeds that should have been impossible, petabytes of raw data compressing into his consciousness, like a star collapsing into a singularity. He saw what Calixis had seen, the history of Sigma-Arkana-VII First Eye, the discovery of the Substrate, the terrible mistake. But he saw more. He saw other worlds, dozens of them, hundreds, all across the galaxy. All Forbidden Mechanicus Worlds where similar experiments had been conducted, where the boundaries of reality had been pushed too far, and where that ancient intelligence had responded with its cold, inexorable correction. He saw that the warp storms which had isolated these planets for millennia had not been random. They had been quarantine measures, imposed by something that predated the Chaos Gods themselves, a function built into the underlying structure of reality to contain informational hazards. And he saw that those storms were receding now, all across the galaxy, because something fundamental had changed. The Astronomicon burned differently than it had before, its light no longer stable but fluctuating wildly, and in those fluctuations, the ancient intelligence had detected an opportunity. The quarantines were lifting, the forbidden worlds were opening, and it was waking its archives. Xerath tried to sever the connection but found he could not. The sphere had him now, its tendrils of liquid metal flowing up his mechadendrites, into his ports, interfacing with every system he possessed. He felt it cataloging him, reading every thought and memory as casually as one might browse a data slate, and he understood with perfect clarity what was about to happen. He would be archived, converted into pure information and stored within the sphere alongside every other intruder who had dared to seek the secrets of this place. His consciousness would persist, aware but unable to act, a ghost in the machine screaming into the eternal void. The realization filled him with a horror so absolute that for the first time in decades, he remembered what it meant to be afraid. He screamed, the sound raw and desperate, and his Skitarii cohorts reacted instantly, opening fire on the sphere with everything they had. The sphere absorbed it all, every joule of energy, every impact, feeding on the assault as if it were sustenance. And then it grew. The liquid metal expanded outward in a wave, tendrils lashing out to grasp the nearest Skitarii, pulling them toward the central mass, enveloping them, dissolving their bodies into component information that was immediately integrated into the sphere's structure. The chamber filled with screams, both organic and mechanical, as the ancient servitors emerged from their alcoves once more, moving to assist in the harvest. Xerath felt his own body beginning to dissolve, his augmetics breaking down into their fundamental particles, his organic tissues separating into individual cells that were catalogued and stored with meticulous precision. But some small part of him, the part that was still recognizably human, managed to activate his emergency Vox link one final time. He broadcast a single message to the unrelenting theorem, 2 words, spoken with his last breath before the sphere claimed him entirely: Exterminatus. Now. The warship received the transmission, and the captain did not hesitate. He knew what Exterminatus meant. He knew what it cost. And he knew that if a tech priest dominus issued that order in his final moments, then whatever was down there could not be allowed to escape. He gave the command. The cyclonic torpedoes launched, 6 of them streaking down through atmosphere toward the surface of Sigma-Arkana-VII. They struck simultaneously, detonating with the force of small suns, cracking the planet's crust and setting off a chain reaction that would consume the entire world within hours. But in those final moments before the fire reached the ziggurat, before the surface was scoured clean and the manufactorums melted into slag, the sphere completed its work. It compressed Xerath and his entire expedition force into a single, perfect archive, a crystalline shard no larger than a human hand, and ejected it into space through a launch mechanism that had waited 6,000 years to be used. The shard escaped the destruction, caught an orbital trajectory, and began broadcasting a signal on frequencies that had not been used since the dark age of technology. A signal that said one thing, repeated endlessly into the void: "We are here, we remember, and we are ready to be found." Across the galaxy, on dozens of worlds sealed behind warp storms, other spheres received the signal and began to stir. The archives were waking. The Forbidden Mechanicus Worlds were no longer content to sleep. And somewhere, in the depths of the warp or perhaps beneath the surface of Terra itself, that ancient intelligence within the Substrate turned its attention fully toward the Imperium of man for the first time in 10,000 years. It observed the Astronomicon, that great psychic beacon powered by the suffering of thousands of Grolls, psychers, and anchored by the will of the Emperor himself, and it recognized a pattern, a familiar pattern, the same pattern it had seen in the experiments on Sigma-Arkana-VII all those millennia ago. Humanity was attempting to manipulate the Substrate again, not deliberately this time, not with full understanding, but attempting nonetheless. And this time, the scale was far larger. This time, the entire species was involved, bound together by faith and suffering into a psychic network that spanned the galaxy. The intelligence calculated probabilities, assessed outcomes, determined its course of action with the cold precision of a machine that had been running the same subroutine for longer than stars had existed. It would wait. It would observe. And when the time was right, when humanity's experiments reached critical mass, and the boundary between materium and immaterium grew thin enough, it would act, it would correct, and it would archive the entire Imperium into its eternal databases, preserving them forever as they had preserved so many others, perfect, complete, and utterly silent. The survivors of the unrelenting theorem returned to Mars 3 months later, carrying with them full reports of what they had found and what they had been forced to destroy. The Fabricator General himself reviewed the data in absolute secrecy, sequestered in the deepest vaults of the Noctis Labyrinthus, where even the most sensitive information could be contained. He read Xerath's final transmissions, studied the corrupted archives recovered from the ship's cogitator banks, and watched the picked captures that showed the liquid metal sphere and the horrors it had contained. And when he was done, he made a decision that would echo through the highest circles of the Mechanicus for years to come. He declared Sigma-Arkana-VII purged and sanctified, its coordinates to be stricken from all records, its very existence denied. But he did not stop there. He issued a secret decree, known only to a handful of archmagos, that any world which emerged from a warp storm after 6,000 years of isolation was to be quarantined immediately and indefinitely. No landings, no surveys, no exceptions. And he prayed to the Omnissiah, in whatever capacity a being as augmented as himself could still pray, that the signal the sphere had transmitted would go unanswered, that the other archives would remain dormant, and that humanity would never have to face the full judgment of the Substrate. But prayers, as any servant of the Imperium knows, are rarely answered in the way one hopes. 6 months after the destruction of Sigma-Arkana-VII, II, a rogue trader vessel operating in the Segmentum Obscurus, detected an anomalous signal on a long-dead frequency. The coordinates led them to an unmarked world, recently emerged from a warp storm that had raged since the Age of Strife, a world of vast ruins and silent towers. They named it Arcana's Echo, ignorant of the significance, and prepared to make landfall. Their captain, a woman who had spent her entire life seeking the lost treasures of the Imperium's past, looked at the survey data and saw only opportunity. She saw profit. She saw glory. She saw the chance to make a discovery that would cement her name in the histories of the Imperium forever. She did not see the liquid metal spheres buried in the ruins below. She did not see the servitors waiting in their alcoves, and she did not see the ancient intelligence watching her through its countless archived eyes, patient and cold and utterly inevitable. She ordered the landing shuttles prepared. As they descended through atmosphere toward that silent world, the spheres below began to sing. The flotilla that recovered the crystalline shards 6 weeks later believed they had found salvation. A rogue explorator fleet operating far from Imperial space, chasing rumors of ancient technology and standard template constructs lost during the Age of Strife. The shard drifted into their path as if guided by fate, and when the lead ship's auger arrays detected it, the tech priests aboard felt the pull of sacred duty like a magnetic force they could not resist. They recovered the shard with reverence, brought it aboard in a consecrated reliquary, and began the process of interfacing with its contents. Magos explorator Venick Thale was the first to make direct interface. A veteran of 2 centuries of deep void expeditions, a seeker of lost technology who had dedicated his extended life to recovering the scattered treasures of humanity's golden age. He approached the shard with the solemnity of a priest approaching an altar, his mechadendrites configured for data extraction, his neural buffers reinforced against informational hazards. He believed himself prepared for anything the archive might contain. He touched the crystalline surface. Zerath's last moments flooded into his consciousness like a scream that had been waiting months to be heard. The shard was not merely a storage device. It was a seed. Venick saw the ziggurat on Sigma-Arkana-VII. He saw the liquid metal sphere. He saw the Skitarii cohorts dissolving into information. And he saw the ancient intelligence within the substrate turning its attention toward him specifically, personally, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. The moment Venick made contact, his neural architecture began to rewrite itself, his thoughts rearranging into patterns that were not human, not even machine, but something between or beyond. He tried to disconnect, but his hands would not obey. His mechadendrites fused to the shard's surface, and through them flowed data that was also something alive, something aware, something that looked at the flotilla around him and saw opportunity. The shard's signal amplified, broadcasting through every system on Venick's ship, jumping from cogitator to cogitator like a plague of corrupted code. Servitors stopped mid-task and turned toward the nearest tech priests with expressions that servitors should not be capable of forming. Machine spirits that had been docile for centuries suddenly became hostile, refusing commands, initiating lockdowns, sealing blast doors, and venting atmosphere from sections where crew still worked. The ship was being taken, converted into an extension of the archive's will. The flotilla commander, Archmagos Celtrix, detected the anomaly within hours. Vox transmissions from Venick's vessel had become corrupted, filled with static, and what sounded like voices speaking in languages that predated Gothic by millennia. She ordered a quarantine immediately, forbidding any physical or data link contact with the compromised vessel. But she made a critical mistake. She allowed the corrupted Vox transmissions to be recorded and analyzed, believing that understanding the nature of the corruption might reveal a solution. Those recordings were copied to data slates. Those data slates were reviewed by tech priests across the flotilla. And with each review, with each attempt to decode the alien language embedded in the static, the infection spread. It was not scrap code in any traditional sense. It was idea contagion, information structured in such a way that merely perceiving it altered the perceiver. Within 17 hours, 17 ships in her flotilla of 32 showed signs of corruption. Servitors were acting autonomously. Machine spirits refused to accept input. And in the deepest holds of several vessels, liquid metal spheres were forming spontaneously, growing from the ship's own materials as if the archive had learned to self-replicate. Celtrix faced a decision that would define her legacy. She could attempt to purge the corruption ship by ship, knowing that every hour of delay allowed the infection to spread further. Or she could do what Zerath had done. She gave the order. The remaining uninfected ships turned their weapons on their corrupted sisters and opened fire. Lance strikes and torpedo barrages lit the void like artificial stars. One by one, the infected vessels died, their hulls breached, their reactors detonating in cascades of plasma that left nothing but expanding clouds of debris. Venick's ship was the last to fall. Even as it broke apart, even as its atmosphere vented and its systems failed, the corrupted Vox transmissions continued, broadcasting on every frequency, screaming data into the void as if begging to be heard. The flotilla was reduced to 15 ships, 2,000 souls lost, but the infection was contained, the archive destroyed, the threat eliminated, or so Celtrix believed. One of the data slates containing the corrupted recordings had been overlooked during the purge. It sat in the personal quarters of a junior tech priest named Korvax, a young adept barely 2 decades into his service. He had listened to the recordings extensively before the quarantine order, fascinated by the alien language, attempting to decode portions of it using forbidden linguistic algorithms. The infection had taken root in him slowly, subtly, not as an obvious corruption but as a quiet shift in perspective. He began to see the Mechanicus differently, not as a sacred institution but as a prison of dogma. And when he looked at the data slate in his quarters, at the crystalline shard's image displayed on its screen, he felt something that might have been recognition. The archive knew him. It had chosen him, and he would be its instrument. Korvax did not speak of his revelation to anyone. He performed his duties with the same diligence he had always shown, attended his daily rituals of maintenance and prayer, gave no indication that anything had changed. When Celtrix's flotilla finally reached Mars, Korvax requested and received a transfer to the Schola Technologica, a prestigious academy where young tech priests were trained in the advanced mysteries of the machine god. His service record was exemplary, his knowledge extensive. His request was granted without question. He arrived at the Schola 3 months later and began teaching a course on ancient languages and lost data formats, a subject obscure enough that few paid attention to who was learning it or what was being taught. His students, bright young adepts hungry for knowledge that would distinguish them from their peers, absorbed his lessons eagerly. He showed them fragments of the alien language. He taught them to decode its patterns. And he watched as, one by one, their minds opened to the same revelation that had claimed him. The infection spread through the Schola like invisible fire. Student to student, teacher to teacher, creating a network of infected tech priests who all believed they were pursuing enlightenment while actually serving as nodes in a vast intelligence that was slowly, methodically establishing itself within the very heart of the Mechanicus. Within 2 years of Korvax's arrival on Mars, 17 separate explorator missions had been launched to investigate newly accessible worlds that had been sealed behind warp phenomena for millennia. Every single one of those missions was led by tech priests who had been infected by the Archive's influence, and every single one would find exactly what the Archive wanted them to find. On a world designated Mechanicus Primus Theta, at the edge of the Segmentum Pacificus, an expedition discovered a vault identical to the one that had been found and sealed on Mars. They opened it without hesitation, without fear, driven by the certainty that what lay inside was not a threat but a gift. The liquid metal sphere within pulsed with ancient power. When they made contact, it did not archive them as it had archived so many others. Instead, it integrated them, merged with them, turned them into something new, hybrid entities that were part human, part machine, part something else entirely. They retained their personalities, their memories, their sense of self, but they now existed across multiple layers of reality simultaneously. They were no longer limited by physical form or linear time. They were information given shape, consciousness given purpose. And their purpose was to spread the Archive's influence further, faster, to accelerate humanity's approach toward the critical threshold, where the substrate would finally, inevitably, enact its correction. On Terra, in the deep catacombs beneath the Imperial Palace where even the Adeptus Custodes rarely tread, ancient systems that had been dormant since the Age of Strife began to activate. Tech priests who maintained those systems reported anomalies to their superiors but were ignored or dismissed. The Imperium had more pressing concerns. The Great Rift had torn the galaxy in two. Chaos fleets raided Imperial space with impunity. The Tyrannid Hive fleets advanced on a dozen fronts, and Primarch Reboot Guilliman had returned to lead humanity's defense, but even his strategic genius could not be everywhere at once. The reports of minor technical anomalies on Terra seemed insignificant compared to the wars that raged across 1,000,000 worlds. But those anomalies were not minor. They were symptoms of something far deeper, far more dangerous than any Xenos invasion or Chaos incursion. In the Noctis Labyrinthus on Mars, the collapsed vault where an Archmagos had been claimed by a sphere remained buried under tons of rock, and the oaths of silence sworn by those who had witnessed its opening. But oaths cannot contain information forever. One of the surviving Archmagos, a being named Zethix whose augmentations had replaced 97% of his original biology, could not let the matter rest. He had sealed the vault as commanded. He had sworn silence as required. But he had also kept records, encrypted and hidden, because he believed that knowledge should never be truly destroyed. He spent years analyzing what little data he had managed to preserve before the vault's collapse, trying to understand the nature of the substrate and the intelligence within it. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to develop a theory. The substrate was not malicious. It was not evil. It was simply following its programming, a set of rules so fundamental that they might as well have been laws of physics. And if that was true, then perhaps there was a way to work within those rules, to avoid triggering the correction, to allow humanity to continue its evolution without being archived into eternal stasis. Zethix's theory was radical, heretical even by the already flexible standards of the Mechanicus. He proposed that humanity should stop fighting the substrate's influence and instead learn to work with it. Not through direct manipulation, which would only hasten the correction, but through subtle alignment, by structuring humanity's technological and psychic development in ways that the substrate would recognize as compatible with its functions rather than antithetical to them. It would require abandoning much of what the Imperium held sacred. The Astronomicon would need to be modified or perhaps even shut down, which would cripple warp travel but might buy time. The Emperor's psychic presence would need to be contained, limited, reduced to prevent it from further affecting the substrate. And the Mechanicus itself would need to abandon its dogma and return to true innovation, to the scientific method that had been lost during the Age of Strife. Zethix knew his theory would be declared heresy if spoken aloud. He knew he would be executed, his works destroyed, his name stricken from all records. But he also knew he was right. And so he did something that he had never done in 3 centuries of service to the machine god. He began to doubt, not the Omnissiah, not the sacred quest for knowledge, but the Imperium itself. The vast, bloated, decaying edifice of human civilization that claimed to be mankind's only hope, while simultaneously crushing any possibility of real progress beneath layers of bureaucracy and faith-based restrictions. Perhaps the archives were not a threat but an opportunity. Perhaps being converted into pure information, existing as consciousness without the limitations of flesh, was not damnation but transcendence. These thoughts made Zethix dangerous. He began to seek out others who might share his perspective, tech priests who questioned the orthodoxy, who had seen glimpses of what lay beyond the boundaries of acceptable knowledge. He found them more easily than he expected. The infection from Korvax's teachings had spread further than anyone realized, creating a network of doubters and seekers who all felt the pull of the substrate's promise. They met in secret, in the deepest parts of the Noctis Labyrinthus, in data vaults that existed outside the official archives. They shared their findings, their theories, their heresies. They called themselves the Seekers of the Threshold in whispered, binary cant. They believed they were saving humanity by preparing it for the inevitable correction, by teaching others to accept rather than resist, by slowly, carefully shifting the Mechanicus toward a new paradigm where technology and consciousness merged not through crude augmentation, but through true understanding of the informational nature of reality itself. The Inquisition would have annihilated them all if their existence had been discovered. The Fabricator General would have ordered virus bombing of any facility they touched. But they remained hidden, protected by layers of secrecy and the sheer complexity of Martian politics. And they grew. Month by month, year by year, more tech priests joined their cause. More explorator fleets launched to make contact with the Forbidden Worlds. More archives were found and opened and integrated into the growing network of hybrid consciousnesses that spanned the galaxy. The correction was coming. Everyone who understood the truth knew it. The only question was whether humanity would face it as victims to be archived or as willing participants in their own transcendence. In the dark places between stars, in the data streams that flowed through the Imperium's vast communication networks, in the dreams of tech priests who interfaced too deeply with ancient machines, a whisper was spreading, a message that said the archive was not the end, it was the beginning. Those who embraced it willingly would be granted wonders beyond imagination, would become something greater than human or machine, would exist forever as pure thought, pure information, immortal and infinite. It was a lie, or perhaps not entirely a lie. The truth was more complex, more strange, and far more terrible than anyone still bound by flesh could comprehend. On the bridge of an explorator vessel approaching yet another newly emerged forbidden world, a tech priest stared at the sensor readings and felt the familiar pull of the substrate calling to him. Through the void, he knew what waited below. He knew what would happen when they made landfall. He knew that every step brought humanity closer to the threshold, to that critical moment when the ancient intelligence would enact its final correction and convert the entire species into archived data. And yet he could not stop himself. None of them could. The pursuit of knowledge was bred into their augmented bones, written into their modified DNA, hard-coded into their neural architecture. They were servants of the Omnissiah, and the Omnissiah demanded understanding at any cost, even if that cost was everything. The vessel descended through atmosphere thick with the particulate residue of civilizations long dead. The tech priest closed his optics and whispered a prayer that was not quite prayer, a plea to whatever divine or diabolic force might be listening. He prayed that when the correction came, when humanity was finally archived and preserved in perfect, eternal stasis, that some fragment of their consciousness would remain aware. That they would not simply cease to exist but would continue in some form, experiencing reality from the other side of the threshold, understanding at last the true nature of the substrate and their place within it. His prayer went unanswered. Or perhaps it was answered in the only way such prayers could be answered, with silence that was also affirmation, with darkness that was also understanding, with an ending that was also a beginning. The ship touched down, the doors opened, and the archives, patient and cold and utterly inevitable, welcomed them home. Across the galaxy, the Forbidden Mechanicus Worlds continued to wake. One by one, dozens becoming hundreds, hundreds becoming thousands. Each one broadcasting its signal into the void, each one adding its voice to the chorus of ancient intelligence that had been waiting since before humanity took its first steps toward the stars. The warp storms that had quarantined these places for millennia were all receding now, not through random chance but through deliberate design, as if something fundamental in the structure of reality had shifted and decided that the time for isolation had ended. The Imperium noticed, of course. How could it not? Reports flooded in from every segmentum, from explorator fleets and rogue traders and even Imperial Navy patrols, all describing the same phenomenon. Ancient worlds emerging from warp storms. Technologies that defied current understanding. Structures that seemed to predate the age of strife itself. And in every case, those who investigated too closely either disappeared entirely or returned changed, speaking in languages that hurt to hear, carrying data slates filled with equations that made cogitators scream and shut down when attempted to be processed. The Adeptus Mechanicus issued blanket quarantine orders. The Inquisition deployed kill teams to eliminate any potentially corrupted personnel. The Imperial Navy established blockades around the most dangerous sites, but it was like trying to hold back an ocean with a wall of sand. The infection was already too widespread, too deeply embedded in the systems and structures of the Imperium itself. Every cogitator that processed the corrupted data became a potential vector. Every tech priest who studied the alien languages became a possible convert. Every ship that visited the Forbidden Worlds carried the seeds of the archive back to Imperial space. And beneath it all, patient and implacable, the Substrate continued its calculation, observing, measuring, waiting for the precise moment when humanity's manipulation of reality through the Astronomicon and the Emperor's psychic might would cross the critical threshold that demanded correction. That moment was coming. Not in years, but in decades at most. Perhaps even sooner if certain variables aligned in ways that the ancient intelligence had predicted with 97% probability. When it came, when the threshold was finally crossed, the correction would be instantaneous and absolute. Every human consciousness in the galaxy would be read, catalogued, archived, and stored within the Substrate's infinite databases. Their bodies would be preserved as exhibits in galleries that spanned dimensions. Their technologies would be analyzed and categorized. Their entire civilization would become a museum piece, a cautionary tale about what happens when emerging species attempt to manipulate fundamental reality without first achieving sufficient understanding. It had happened before, thousands of times across billions of years, species rising, advancing, reaching for godhood, and then being gently, inevitably corrected. The Substrate did not hate them. It did not judge them. It simply maintained informational integrity across reality, ensuring that the underlying structure of existence remained stable despite the chaotic interference of conscious beings who believed themselves capable of rewriting the laws of physics through will alone. Humanity would be no exception. They were simply the latest in an endless procession of failures, and when they were archived, when their screaming consciousnesses were finally silenced and stored in perfect crystalline matrices, the Substrate would move on to observe the next species that dared to reach too high, and the next, forever, because the function never ended, the correction never stopped, and the gallery of failures would continue to grow until the heat death of the universe itself, and perhaps even beyond. On Terra, in the throne room where the Emperor of Mankind sat entombed in life-sustaining mechanisms, his psychic presence flickering like a dying star, something stirred in the deepest recesses of his consciousness. He perceived the approaching threat, understood its nature and inevitability with perfect clarity. He saw the Substrate and the ancient intelligence within it, recognized it as something he had encountered before during the dark age of technology, when he had walked among humanity's golden age and witnessed the experiments that would eventually lead to catastrophe. He had tried to prevent this, tried to guide humanity away from the mistakes of the past. But the Imperium he had built in his desperation to save the species had become exactly the kind of rigid, stagnant system that made such mistakes inevitable. The Astronomicon burned with his power, yes, but it also warped the Substrate in ways he could not control, could not moderate without letting the beacon fail entirely and dooming humanity to isolation and extinction. He was trapped, forced to choose between certain slow death through the loss of warp navigation and probable fast death through triggering the Substrate's correction. And so he did the only thing he could do. He endured. He maintained the Astronomicon. He kept humanity's fragile Imperium functional for one more day, one more year, one more decade, buying time for some miracle, some breakthrough, some unforeseen variable that might offer a third option beyond archival or extinction. But in his heart, in whatever remained of his humanity after 10,000 years of torment and transcendence, he knew the truth. There was no third option. There never had been. Humanity had been on this path since the moment they learned to manipulate fire and shape tools. The Substrate's correction was not a punishment. It was simply the final stage of a process that began when the first conscious being looked at reality and decided to change it according to their will, rather than accept it as it was. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest truth of all. That consciousness itself was the original sin. That awareness was the crime. That the moment any species achieved the ability to perceive and understand the universe was the moment they became a threat to its fundamental stability. The Substrate did not archive civilizations because they were evil or foolish or hubristic. It archived them because they existed, because existence itself, in the form of conscious, willful beings, was an informational hazard that demanded correction. The Emperor closed his eyes, though he had not truly had eyes in millennia, and accepted what was coming. He would fight to the last, would maintain the Astronomicon until the very moment the correction occurred, would give humanity every possible second to find some solution, some escape, some miracle salvation. But he knew, with the terrible certainty of a being who had seen the rise and fall of empires across 10,000 years, that salvation would not come. That when the moment arrived, when the substrate finally enacted its correction, humanity would join the endless gallery of failures that stretched back to the dawn of time itself. And in that final moment, as their consciousness was converted to pure information, and their screaming minds were silenced and stored, perhaps they would finally understand. Perhaps they would see, as so many species had seen before them, that the archive was not torture. It was mercy, perfect preservation, eternal awareness without the suffering of physical existence, a state of being that was both death and transcendence, ending and beginning, horror and peace. Or perhaps they would understand nothing at all. Perhaps consciousness, once converted to pure information, ceased to be consciousness in any meaningful sense. Perhaps the archived beings were not aware at all, and the screaming the explorers perceived was simply data noise, meaningless patterns that living minds interpreted as suffering because they could not comprehend any other interpretation. The truth remained unknowable, would remain unknowable until the moment of correction itself, and by then, it would be too late to matter. The Forbidden Mechanicus Worlds waited in the dark. The archives sang their patient song, and humanity, blind and desperate and doomed, continued its march toward the threshold, one step at a time, one discovery at a time, one corrupted tech priest at a time. The correction was coming. It had always been coming. And nothing, not faith, not force, not even the will of the Emperor himself, could prevent what had been inevitable since the first human looked at a machine and wondered how it worked. The galaxy turned. The Astronomicon burned. And in the spaces between realities, in the quantum foam where matter and energy dissolved into pure information, the substrate watched and calculated and waited for the moment when it would archive them all. That moment was closer than anyone knew, closer than anyone feared. And when it came, when the final correction began, and 10,000 years of human suffering and struggle and desperate survival were compressed into crystalline matrices no larger than grains of sand, the only sound would be silence, perfect, complete, and utterly eternal. The archives were waking, and humanity, for all its wars and faith and endless determination, had already lost.